Silence. That was the first thing I noticed. A deep, unsettling quiet that pressed against my ears like a physical weight. Something was terribly wrong with this old lighthouse, and I was about to find out exactly what. Are you ready to step into a world where secrets whisper in the dark and every shadow hides a truth? Welcome to How Ancient Egyptians Really Lived and More, a tale that will leave you questioning everything you know. If you love suspense, mystery, and deep twists, then this is your stop. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss a single spine-tingling chapter. And hey, I'm curious, what time is it where you are right now? Comment your local time below to let me know when you're joining the journey. Let's begin. When we close our eyes and conjure an image of ancient Egypt, the scenes that flash through our minds are grand and dramatic. The colossal statues of Ramses II, the glittering treasures of Tutankhamun, and the silent, imposing geometry of the Great Pyramids. We focus on the spectacle, the divine power, and the brilliant history that spanned millennia. But this focus often misses the fundamental, bedrock reality of the Egyptian existence. A reality built not of gold and magic, but of the slow, steady, and utterly boring rhythm of the river, the field, and the administrative pen. We turn away from the magnificent and the glorious tonight, delving into the quiet, dusty heart of ancient Egypt, where millions of ordinary citizens lived out their lives in a predictable cycle that delivered stability, yet also a profound, hushed monotony. This is the Egypt of ever-present mud, coarse grain, and the vast, repetitive labor required just to survive. The great engine of all Egyptian life, the source of its stability and its endless routine, was the River Nile. More specifically, it was the river's annual flood, arriving with such predictable regularity that it served as the kingdom's only calendar and clock. Imagine living in a world where the most vital event of the year, the one that guaranteed your very survival, happened at nearly the same moment, with the same intensity, year after year, for over 3,000 years. This is the ultimate source of the predictable boredom that infused everything. The year was divided simply into 3 seasons, each demanding profoundly repetitive tasks. Aked, the season of inundation; Pere, the season of growing; and Shamu, the season of harvest. Annually, the required tasks for each season were identical. Wait during the flood, plow and sow during the growth, and cut and store during the harvest. It was a calendar of complete and total cyclical immutability, where deviation was rare and routine was king. Let us begin our gentle exploration with the peasant's home, the mud-brick dwellings where families found refuge from the relentless sun. These houses were the antithesis of the pyramids. They were organic, temporary, and required constant, tedious maintenance. They were built from taffel, or Nile River mud, mixed with straw for cohesion, pressed into a wooden mold, and left to dry in the arid air. The process of building a home was a long, slow exercise in repetition. Mix the mud, press the mold, dry the brick, stack the brick, repeat. There was no rush, only the continual, heavy effort of kneading earth until the wall slowly rose. Once built, these porous, dark homes demanded a specific chore intrinsic to boredom: annual maintenance. Because the bricks were not kiln-fired, they were vulnerable to crumbling, erosion, and insect damage. Every year before the next flood, the family had to engage in the ritual of replastering the walls with fresh mud and re-whitewashing the surfaces. It was an act of constant deferral. You weren't improving the home, you were just preventing it from dissolving back into the earth. The early morning routine was dominated by preparing the 2 chief foodstuffs, bread and beer. Unlike the modern world of refined flour, the grain used, primarily emmer wheat, was tough and difficult to process. This leads us to the most universal, repetitive, and physically demanding chore of the Egyptian kitchen: grinding grain on the saddle quern. Picture the scene: a woman kneeling on a woven mat inside the dark, cool core of the house. Before her is a large, flat lower stone, and in her hands is a heavy, rounded upper stone. For 2, perhaps 3 hours every day, she performs the exact same motion, pushing the heavy upper stone back and forth over the kernels scattered on the lower slab. The sound is a harsh, steady, rhythmic scrape, a sound that echoed through every village, every neighborhood for 30 centuries. It was not a quick or exciting job. It was a slow, debilitating exercise in endurance. The outcome of this grinding was coarse, inevitably gritty flour, full of tiny stone fragments which, over a lifetime, led to the predictable, chronic dental wear of every Egyptian person. The boredom of the chore was literally etched into their physical bodies. Perhaps the single most iconic image of repetitive, dull labor in Egyptian history is the use of the shadoof. This simple machine, a long counterbalance pole used to scoop water from a channel or riverbank up to higher irrigation ditches, was the key apparatus for keeping fields alive during the dry season. Operating the shadoof was a mind-numbingly repetitive, hypnotically tedious task. The operator stood next to the channel, reached down to dunk the bucket, pulled the counterweight to lift the water, and then swung it over to dump into the ditch. Dip, lift, pivot. Dip, lift, pivot. Dip, lift, pivot. Hour after hour under the blazing sun, the operator's mind would enter a mechanical, forced meditative state, the body moving only the few required feet back and forth, the only sound the creak of the beam and the gentle splash of water. The amount of water lifted by a single shadoof was minute, meaning the process had to be repeated literally thousands of times just to water a small patch of land. It was work that required no mental sharpness, only the capacity for endless, unchanging motion. The ultimate lullaby of labor, stretched across the vast, flat monotony of the cultivated land. This was the true engine of Egyptian civilization, the absolute repetitive boredom of physical toil. The deep-seated predictability extended beyond the fields and into the very structure of society and the state. To the peasant, the pharaoh was a distant, divine force, but the scribe was a constantly present, often irritating reality. This massive, sprawling bureaucracy was fueled by an obsessively meticulous process of tallying, recording, and auditing. Every bushel of grain, every head of cattle, every hour of labor dedicated to a public project had to be accounted for. The administrative process existed in a permanent state of paperwork and assessment, and the most exciting moment of the season was often the arrival of the local official to measure the flood line and estimate the inevitable tax yield. A moment not of triumph, but of profound, dull anxiety. These endless records required not innovation, but endless, careful replication on rolls of papyrus or shards of pottery. The same forms, the same symbols, the same numbers, year after predictable year. This mountain of administration was simply another layer of unchanging, boring routine. The slow, grinding rhythm of the state demanding its due, always through the medium of the written word. This administrative monotony was underpinned by a social monotony that was arguably the heaviest burden of all, the absolute, near impossible lack of social mobility. For most Egyptians, their life's path was set at birth with the same finality as the course of the Nile itself. The son of a farmer would be a farmer. The daughter of a weaver would become a weaver. There was a rigid, unbreakable hierarchy, and the sheer effort required to ascend even a single step was monumental. This meant that the hopes and anxieties of one generation were almost perfectly replicated by the next. There was little concept of making a new life or inventing yourself. There was only the dignified acceptance of the role inherited and the tireless effort to perform that role as effectively as one's parents had. This generational sameness provided stability, but it smothered individual ambition under the heavy blanket of collective, unchanging tradition. This pervasive, deep-seated routine extended even to the most intimate details of life, the food on the plate. While banquets for the elite offered variety, the common Egyptian lived on a diet of unrelenting culinary sameness. Every single meal, from the earliest morning to the last light, was built around the core trinity: bread, beer, and onions. The coarse, gritty bread provided the bulk. The thick, murky beer, which was more like a nutritious porridge than a modern beverage, provided calories and hydration, and the pungent onion, or perhaps a turnip or lentil, offered the only hint of flavor or change. Day after day, season after season, the peasant woke up to, ate for lunch, and retired after consuming the same fundamental components. There were no novel recipes, no sudden influx of spices, no yearly culinary shifts. The stability of the harvest meant the stability of the meal, creating a monotonous yet reliable fuel for the daily labor. The very act of eating became part of the background noise of life, a necessity fulfilled with predictable ingredients and preparation. Finally, even the realm of the divine was dominated by spiritual routine. The entire purpose of Egyptian religion was the maintenance of Ma'at, the cosmic order, which required fixed, unchanging ritual. The same prayers, the same offerings, the same recitations, and the same festivals repeated every year to ensure the sun rose, the Nile flooded, and chaos was held at bay. Imagine a world where devotion is measured not by passion or spontaneity, but by the perfect, precise repetition of ancient acts. Even the great cycle of death was pre-programmed. The preparation for the afterlife was a routine. The exact same spells, the same funerary goods, the same ritualized process of mummification. Death was not an unpredictable end, but a scheduled transition, one that required the living to follow a fixed, centuries-old instruction manual to ensure the deceased was properly equipped for eternal, unchanging existence. It was in this absolute, unyielding framework of sameness, social, administrative, dietary, and spiritual, that the vast 3 millennia-long civilization was built, transforming relentless boredom into eternal, monumental stability. The combined weight of these relentless routines, natural, bureaucratic, social, and culinary, created a civilization built not on spontaneous genius or disruptive innovation, but on radical institutional predictability. For the average Egyptian, their life was a meticulous equation where the variables remained constant. The required labor output, the expected tax quota, the traditional method of burial, and the ingredients for the evening meal were all known quantities, fixed by centuries of precedent. This was not a flaw in the system, it was the entire foundation. This deep-seated stability was formalized in the core tenet of Egyptian thought. Ma'at was the divine concept of cosmic order, truth, and justice, which demanded that every act, great or small, conform to an eternal, unchanging template. The pharaoh's duty was the ritualistic maintenance of Ma'at. The peasant's duty was simply to live and work within its unwavering guidelines. In this worldview, predictability was divinity, and change was synonymous with chaos. Therefore, the monotony was not a side effect of their civilization, but its primary operational engine. The collective willingness of millions to accept and repeat the same tasks, the same records, and the same rituals, generation after generation, provided the stable economic and social surplus required for projects of immense, terrifying scale. It is here that the great paradox of ancient Egypt lies. The most dramatic, eternal achievements were constructed from the most mundane, repetitive lives. The pyramids, the Karnak hypostyle halls, the vast royal tombs, these monumental structures that proclaim timeless divine glory are, in reality, the ultimate, enduring products of organizational boredom. They are monuments not to singular moments of genius, but to the collective ability to perform simple, identical tasks an infinite number of times. They represent the total victory of routine over improvisation. Ultimately, the enduring legacy of ancient Egypt is not just the artifacts left behind, but the profound illustration of how civilization can be built upon the intentional subsumption of individual desire into the rhythm of the collective. Their 3 millennia of unbroken success were a testament to the power of the known, the expected, and the repeated. For the peasant who stood year after year, grinding grain, paying tax, and waiting for the flood, the eternal monument served as a powerful, albeit dull, confirmation. His monotonous life was not meaningless, but the indispensable, predictable foundation upon which the divine and the eternal were built. Our gentle drift across the sands of ancient Egypt now brings us to the very structures that define its dramatic legacy, the pyramids and the temples. We often imagine these colossal projects as scenes of frantic, last-minute heroic effort, driven by whips and desperation. But the reality, like everything else in Egypt, was built upon schedule, calculation, and immense seasonal boredom. Building a monumental structure was not a chaotic event. It was a scheduled government program, framed by the predictable rhythm of the Nile. The peak labor season was Akhet, the season of inundation. When the floodwaters covered the fields, the majority of the agricultural workforce was temporarily idle. The pharaoh, the ultimate efficiency expert, simply redirected this vast idle labor pool to the quarries and construction sites. This was not enslavement in the frenzied sense. It was mandatory, scheduled unemployment relief, paid in beer, bread, and onions. The work was less a desperate scramble and more a seasonal obligation. The physical act of construction was the very definition of repetitive, low-skill, high-effort labor. Consider the simple task of moving a block of stone, often quarried miles away. The blocks were loaded onto wooden sledges. The path was prepared not with smooth ramps, but by constantly pouring water or slick Nile mud beneath the runners. The work consisted of scores of men pulling on ropes, moving the sledge forward a few feet at a time. The sound was a dull, rhythmic chant, and the heavy, continuous crunch of the sledge runners on the muddy path. It was a day of slow, synchronized, back-breaking pulling and stopping. Pull, slide, pause. Pull, slide, pause. There was no speed, only the necessary sustained application of uniform force, repeated thousands upon thousands of times across the scorching, unchanging landscape. The sheer number of repeated pulls, repeated alignments, and repeated simple pushes, not the technical difficulty of the architecture, is what built the pyramids. Once the blocks arrived, the process of placing them was similarly characterized by extreme, unhurried precision. The stones had to be fitted together with painstaking accuracy. This required endless measuring and remeasuring, followed by the tedious rubbing of one stone against the other to achieve the perfect, seamless fit. This rubbing might take hours, producing nothing but fine stone dust and a low, grating sound, achieving an almost microscopic level of precision through the most monotonous means possible. The entire construction cycle, lasting decades, was a victory of scale achieved through the sheer repetition of simple, identical actions. The monotony of the builders' lives literally created the eternal boredom of the monument. This commitment to ritualistic, unchanging process found its ultimate expression in the bureaucracy of death, the ritual of mummification. This was not a moment of high drama or improvised grief. It was a 70-day industrial process, meticulously documented and rigidly followed for thousands of years. The embalmer's job was the very definition of professional, specialized, and utterly boring routine. The cycle began, and the clock was ticking, not towards an exciting deadline, but toward the completion of 65 to 70 highly specific, unvarying steps. The first few days involved the monotonous and rather messy task of internal extraction. The brain was removed through the nostrils using a long, repetitive insertion and stirring action. A chore done with a hook, demanding specialized knowledge but no excitement, only the unpleasant, repetitive jiggle and scrape. The abdomen was then open, and the internal organs, the lungs, liver, stomach, and intestines, were carefully removed and cataloged. This removal and cataloging was a task of dry, clinical repetition. Organs placed in their respective pre-assigned canopic jars, each jar dedicated to one of the four sons of Horus. The core of the process was the 70-day drying period. The body was packed and covered in massive amounts of natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture. For over 2 months, the embalmers performed the monotonous job of monitoring the process, occasionally turning the body, and ensuring the salt remained dry and functional. This period of waiting was the true test of the embalmer's patience, a long, dry, motionless, uneventful vigil, the kind of suspended animation that makes time stretch out into infinity. Once dried, the body was then meticulously wrapped. This was arguably the most tedious phase of all. It was not a quick bandaging. It was the slow, precise winding of hundreds of yards of linen strips, layer upon layer. Each limb was wrapped separately, each finger and toe meticulously bound. The wrappings were often interspersed with various amulets, each placed in its exact, prescribed position, necessitating pauses, checks, and restarts. The sound in the embalmer's workshop would have been the soft, continuous shh of linen being pulled taut, the occasional whisper of an ancient spell, and the silent, focused concentration of the workers. This ritualized repetition ensured that the body was prepared perfectly for the next step, a final, eternal existence that was itself defined by unchanging predictability. Even the artwork within the tomb was a testament to creative monotony. We admire the vibrant colors and detailed scenes, but the artists themselves were bound by an unyielding artistic conservatism. For 3 millennia, Egyptian art adhered to the same conventions, the same rigid poses, the same conventional coloring, the same depiction of authority and hierarchy. The human figures followed the frontality principle. Eyes viewed straight on, shoulders facing the front, but head and legs viewed in profile. The artists who painted the hundreds of feet of tomb walls were not encouraged to innovate. They were required to replicate. They would paint the same farming scenes, the same offering bearers, and the same judgment scenes in the same manner as their great-grandparents had. It was a trade built on perfect, identical copying, where success was measured by how closely one could adhere to the eternal, fixed style of the past. The boredom of artistic replication was the necessary price paid for creating an unchanging, eternal visual record, ensuring that even in death, the Egyptians were surrounded by the reassuring, predictable patterns of life, as it should always be. Having explored the repetition in labor and death, let us now turn our attention to the one thing that governed all Egyptian life: time itself. Time for the Egyptians was not a wild, unpredictable river, but a perfectly engineered, repeatable cycle. This brings us to the Egyptian calendar, a system of such remarkable structured predictability that it dictated the lives of millions for millennia. And yes, it was incredibly monotonous. The primary calendar was the civil calendar, a marvel of bureaucratic simplicity and rigidity. It was divided into 12 months of 30 days each, for a total of 360 days. To this were added 5 extra, sacred or epagamental days at the end of the year, bringing the total to a neat, predictable 365. This structure had 2 profound, boring virtues. First, every single month was identical, 3 weeks of 10 days each. This made bureaucratic accounting, tax collection, and labor scheduling utterly simple. Second, the calendar was divorced from the real movement of the stars. It was essentially a fixed clock. The problem, of course, is that the real solar year is closer to 365.225 days. Over time, the civil calendar began to drift away from the Sothic calendar, which was based on the predictable heliacal rising of the star Sirius, which coincided with the Nile's annual flood. Every 4 years, the civil calendar was off by an entire day. This tiny, predictable error meant that the seasons, which were named for the real agricultural cycles, Akhet, Pere, Shemu, slowly, inexorably rotated through the calendar. For 1,000 years, a peasant might pay his harvest tax in the month of Thoth, only to have his great-great-grandson pay the same tax in the month of Phalphi, even though the actual harvest was happening at the same time every year. The Egyptians knew about this drift, this slow, bureaucratic slide, but they allowed it to continue. Why? Because the civil calendar's predictability, 30 days, 3 seasons, fixed names, was more valuable to their administrative machine than scientific accuracy. It was a beautiful example of the bureaucracy prioritizing the predictable repetition of the record over the chaotic reality of nature. The result was a system of time management that was perfectly predictable, perfectly uniform, and yet completely out of sync with the world it was supposed to measure. A truly boring, high-level administrative quirk. The engine room of this vast, monotonous machine was the scribe. If the farmer provided the muscle for repetition, the scribe provided the memory. The scribe was a respected, literate man who spent his entire life mastering a single, repetitive craft, the recording of data. Their world was one of papyrus scrolls, reed pens, and the meticulous application of ink to paper, or more accurately, ink to reed fiber. Consider the daily life of a scribe tasked with inventorying grain for the temple granary. His entire day was spent in a silent room, crouched, probably in an uncomfortable posture, writing the same symbols over and over again. The process of writing hieratic script, the cursive form of hieroglyphs used for daily business, was a slow, deliberate act. The noise of the scribe's day was minimal. The whisper of the reed pen against the papyrus, the damp tap of the brush being loaded with black or red ink, and the occasional sigh of administrative frustration. The records themselves were tedious. They didn't write exciting histories. They wrote lists, receipts of grain, 10 sacks from Usaramon, 12 sacks from Nebseni, disbursements of beer, 2 jars to the stonecutters, 3 jars to the temple priests, and roll call for workers, Jedafre present, Eri Hor absent. The scribe was the human embodiment of the spreadsheet. His purpose was not to think, but to record and repeat. Every transaction, every tax payment, every boundary marker, every legal decision, all had to be faithfully recorded in a standardized format, using a standardized style, for the purpose of future, predictable retrieval. The training of a scribe, which took years, was essentially an exercise in boredom tolerance, learning to draw the same 700-plus symbols flawlessly, tirelessly, and identically. The entire administrative state, from the pharaoh's decree down to the lowliest village harvest quota, rested on the scribe's ability to perform monotonous, perfect paperwork. This vast archival system was necessary because Egyptian society viewed every legal, economic, and religious decision not as a new choice, but as the repetition of a previous, successful one. When a new pharaoh took the throne, the scribes didn't invent new rules. They simply pulled out the records of the previous pharaohs and ensured that the rituals, taxes, and government structure were identical to the past. The scribes were the keepers of the administrative cycle, ensuring that tomorrow's paperwork would be just as boring and predictable as yesterday's. They were, in the most profound sense, the guardians of the administrative status quo. The sound of the scribe's pen, whispering endlessly in the quiet, dusty offices, was the true soundtrack of eternal Egypt. Our slow journey through ancient Egypt now shifts from the great monuments and endless paperwork to the equally immutable rhythm of the economy and the monotony of domestic life. In a land where everything was fixed, even commerce was based on calculations, repetition, and the absence of a simple invention like coin money. Imagine trying to purchase a new pair of sandals or a jar of expensive oil when you have no cash in your pocket. For most of Egyptian history, the economy operated on a complex and utterly tedious system of barter paired with fixed, calculated values. This wasn't simple exchange, one thing for another. It was an endless, repetitive exercise in arithmetical calculation and value negotiation. To facilitate trade, they used a unit of account, a virtual currency, called the daben. A daben was a standard weight, usually around 91 grams, often of copper. No one walked around with a bag of copper daben to pay for daily goods. Instead, everything was assigned a daben value, and every transaction was a complex equation of equivalent items. Consider a simple market transaction. A man wishes to buy a goat. The goat's value is set at 15 daben. The buyer doesn't have 15 copper daben. He has goods. He offers 3 jars of honey, 1 new axe, 1 piece of fine linen. The negotiation was a slow, repetitive process of haggling over the exact, predetermined daben value of each item. The seller would check the weight of the honey, the sharpness of the axe blade, the thread count of the linen, ensuring the quality matched the listed daben value in the administrative records. The sound of the marketplace was a constant hum of calculation and measurement, the clink of scales, the murmuring over weights, and the endless, repeated question, is this worth 1 daben or 1.5? Every single purchase was a custom algebra problem solved through tedious item-by-item verification. The absence of coins meant that the brain had to perform the function of the mint, constantly calculating fractional values throughout the day. This same repetitive calculation governed the most unavoidable reality of Egyptian life, taxation. Because there were no coins, the pharaoh's treasury could not collect silver, it collected in-kind goods. Annually after the predictable harvest season of Shimu, the tax collectors would arrive, initiating the yearly monotonous assessment cycle. Taxes were not a percentage of profit. They were a fixed, pre-calculated quota based on the anticipated yield of the land. Scribes would meticulously measure the grain output, counting every basket. Cattle were counted and branded. Linen was measured by the roll length. The peasant's entire year culminated in this dry, bureaucratic moment, where the fruits of his relentless labor were measured, recorded, and hauled away to the great, dark, cool storage facilities of the state. The most boring part of this entire administrative process was the transportation. The government required the taxes to be moved to the central granaries and treasuries, a job, again, that fell to the laborers. The sound of taxation was the steady creak of ox carts piled high with sacks, moving slowly along the dusty road, repetitively heading toward the capital, followed by the soft thud of sacks being dropped and stacked in massive, dark, cool rooms, with the silent scribes watching, ticking off lists identical to the ones from the year before, and the year before that. The economic pulse of Egypt was defined by the predictable arrival and measurement of raw material, unchanging year after year. Finally, let us retreat to the domestic space, away from the temples and tombs to the Egyptian home. If the temples and tombs were built for eternity in monumental stone, the homes of the living were built out of the most perishable and repetitive material imaginable: mud brick. Entire villages or neighborhoods consisted of uniform, low, flat-roofed blocks packed tightly together. These mud brick homes, made from simple, standardized molds of Nile mud and straw, hardened under the sun, were monotonous by necessity. They were typically small, maybe 2 or 3 rooms deep, clustered around a central courtyard or open space. The uniformity of the material dictated the uniformity of the design: square, boxy, and functional. Because mud brick is not eternal, these houses were in a constant, predictable state of decay and reconstruction. A house might last a few decades before the annual Nile dampness and thermal erosion meant the walls had to be replastered with mud, or the entire structure had to be torn down and rebuilt exactly as it was before, using the same standardized, square bricks. Life in ancient Egypt, even at the level of the hearth and home, involved the continuous, repetitive, structural maintenance against the predictable wear of time. The interior was also simple and unchanging. Furniture was minimal: low stools, woven mats, pottery jars for storage, and perhaps a simple wooden chest. There was little to distract from the domestic routine of grinding the grain, preparing the flatbread, and sleeping on the roof during hot nights. The Egyptian home was a space designed for functional, repetitive domestic labor, a quiet sanctuary from the noisy, repetitive labor of the outside world, yet itself trapped in its own simple cycle of use and structural decay, waiting to be rebuilt identically once more. The pervasive uniformity of the Egyptian world, from temple wall art to domestic architecture, was all built on the same principle: repetition creates stability, and stability is eternity. We've seen the tax collector in the mud brick home. Next, we explore the repetitive details of their diet and cuisine, and the pervasive influence of beer and bread on every waking moment. Having explored the tedious calculations of the marketplace and the endless maintenance of the mud brick home, we now arrive at the Egyptian dinner table. If any single area of life exemplified the principle of unyielding repetition, it was their daily diet, a monotonous yet highly efficient culinary cycle dominated by just 2 items: bread and beer. For the vast majority of the population, every single meal, every single day, revolved around these 2 staples. This was not a diet of choice or variety. It was a diet of necessity and predictability, dictated by the easy cultivation of grain along the Nile. The journey of the bread was itself a testament to domestic monotony. It began with emmer wheat, a tough grain that was difficult to process. The core of daily domestic labor, primarily performed by women, was the repetitive grinding of grain on a saddle quern. This was a physically demanding task, characterized by the slowing, steady sound of stone scraping against stone, performed hour after hour until the grain was reduced to a coarse flour. This routine, performed in every home, every morning, was the most consistent and unchanging sound of ancient Egyptian domestic life. Due to the primitive grinding methods, the resulting flour was inevitably contaminated with fine stone grit and sand. The ancient Egyptians' staple food, therefore, was not only monotonous in flavor, but literally wore down their teeth. Skeletons recovered show severe dental attrition, teeth ground down to the pulp by the gritty, unchanging bread, leading to constant pain and infection. Eating bread was a slow, painful, repetitive, physical assault on the body, endured by the entire population from childhood to old age. Complementing bread was beer, the second universal staple. Egyptian beer was not the clear, carbonated beverage we know today. It was a thick, murky, low-alcohol porridge, literally liquid bread. It was highly nutritious, containing essential vitamins and protein, and was the safest source of hydration, as the brewing process purified the Nile water. The brewing process itself was a repetitive cycle of domestic chemistry. Partially baked loaves of bread, often underbaked specifically for brewing, were crumbled into large vats, mixed with water and left to ferment. The result was a thick liquid that needed to be strained before drinking, leaving a residue that was often consumed as a kind of gruel. Every single worker, from the pharaoh to the field laborer, was allotted a daily ration of beer. It was the fuel of the state, the pay for the worker, and the refreshment for the family. The taste profile never changed. It was the same slightly sour, thick, yeasty, low-alcohol nourishment consumed at sunrise, midday, and sunset. The common diet was thus a triumvirate of repetition: gritty bread, thick beer, and onions. While the wealthy ate beef and fowl at lavish feasts, the average Egyptian ate primarily lentils, beans, onions, garlic, and occasional fish caught from the river. Meat was a rare, ritualistic pleasure reserved for religious holidays or extreme good fortune, not a part of the daily, unchanging schedule. This dietary monotony served a purpose. It was efficient, it supported the massive state workforce, and it reinforced the stability of the social structure. The taste of one day was the taste of the next, and the taste of this year was the taste of the previous century. The repetitive crunch of the gritty bread and the daily intake of thick beer were the final, concrete anchors of the Egyptians' existence, the physical constants in a world defined by the unchanging will of the gods and the cyclical flood of the Nile. We have now examined the monotony of creation, administration, finance, housing, and diet. For the final part, we will discuss the spiritual monotony, the relentless focus on a single, fixed afterlife, and the repetitive rituals designed to maintain it. We conclude our examination of Egyptian monotony by looking at the only area of life more rigid and unchanging than the civil service or the dinner table: their spiritual existence. While modern societies often view the afterlife as a concept of profound transformation or singular ascension, for the ancient Egyptians, the goal was one of relentless maintenance, an eternity dedicated to preserving the perfect status quo they had known on earth. Their afterlife was not a wild, unpredictable heaven. It was simply a perfect, unending repetition of the Nile Valley. The Egyptian afterlife, known as the Field of Reeds, was conceptually boring but functionally perfect. The deceased would continue to farm, eat, and build, but crucially, without the hardship of famine, flood, or early death. It was the present life, made permanently and predictably ideal. This single fixed goal meant that all religious practice and every ritual preparation during life was singularly focused on one outcome, leading to a profound monotony of purpose. Every prayer, every offering, every carving on a tomb wall was designed to secure and sustain the same unchanging continuation. This desire for an eternally unchanging status quo necessitated a vast, continuous, and highly repetitive ritual system. The key rituals were not spiritual flights of fancy, but detailed, administrative procedures designed to ensure the Kai and Embalm of the deceased were successfully reunited with the preserved body. Consider the 70-day mummification process. This was not a spontaneous religious rite. It was a clinical, unchanging protocol established over millennia. Every body, regardless of status, underwent the exact same methodical steps: the prescribed removal of organs, the precise measurement of drying time using natron salt, and the wrapping in specific layers of linen. It was a rote, highly structured procedure performed generation after generation, turning the traumatic reality of death into a predictable administrative task. The embalmers were not just priests, they were technicians carrying out a repetitive, state-mandated function. Even after burial, the maintenance continued. Relatives were tasked with daily or weekly offerings of food, drink, and incense at the tomb chapel. The spell chanting, the precise placing of bread and beer, the recitation of the offering formula, all were endless repetitions designed to sustain the ka until the end of time. This was an inescapable, recurring duty for the living, a promise that the monotony of sustenance would continue even in death. The living were permanently tethered to the tedious administrative requirements of the dead. The ultimate tool of this spiritual monotony was the Book of the Dead, a collection of spells, charms, and prayers intended to guide the deceased through the underworld and guarantee success in the final judgment. It was not a grand work of moral philosophy open to spontaneous interpretation. It was a rote manual of fixed incantations and necessary passwords. Success in the afterlife hinged not on spontaneous faith or personal piety, but on the ability of the deceased to correctly recite specific, predefined verbal formulas at each checkpoint. These spells were often literal, highly specific instructions. Spell for not having to work, spell for opening the mouth, or spell for making a man walk. The deceased's journey was simply a sequence of repetitive, necessary verbal codes to unlock the next stage. Even the famous negative confession at the Hall of Two Truths was a list of 42 pre-written denials, a mechanical recitation designed to secure eternal life. The entire process was one of spiritual bureaucracy, where the right paperwork guaranteed passage and the wrong word meant oblivion. This comprehensive, inescapable pattern, from the mud brick home to the burial chamber, meant that the greatest psychological fear in Egypt was deviation. Repetition was not merely a side effect of their civilization. It was the core philosophical principle that guaranteed their world would endure forever. The entire belief system was geared towards maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic order. The sun rose and set, the Nile flooded and receded, the pharaoh ruled and died. All were perfectly cyclical and predictable. Individual life was an endless cycle of farming, bread-making, and tax-paying, ending in an eternal continuation of that very same cycle. The monotony of their life was, in their minds, the ultimate guarantee of their immortality. And so we leave ancient Egypt, a civilization defined not by the rush of conquest or the drama of revolution, but by the quiet, unyielding rhythm of the Nile, the scratch of the scribe's pen, the predictable creak of the shaduf, and the slow, steady grinding of grain. A civilization that learned how to build 3,000 years of history out of the most profound and enduring form of stable, glorious, and necessary boredom.